All right, everyone, welcome to the session, Building Resilience Starts with Self-Care. And I would like to welcome Ms. Cassie Nagel to the session. She is the Education and Public Awareness Specialist at Children's Home Society of South Dakota. Ms. Nagel has an Associates of Arts degree in Business Administration and a Bachelor of Arts degree in Criminal Justice Studies from the University of South Dakota. Cassie's passion for helping vulnerable populations and making big changes inspired her to focus on prevention efforts. In her role at CHS, she provides education and awareness to audiences ranging from parents to professionals. We'd both like to welcome you to this session, and I will let Cassie take it from here.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Jody, and thank you all for joining me for this session today. It's so sort of a little bit of an out-of-body experience to be able to be on a dais with Dr. Robert Anda. He's somebody whose work I followed for a long time, and as a part of the South Dakota ACEs and Resiliency program, I had the honor of being trained by Dr. Anda himself about 3 years ago when he came to South Dakota, when we first brought his ACE interface program to South Dakota. So to be able to get to sort of see him again is very cool, and to get to hear him present on ACEs and adversity and how trauma affects us is just really an honor to be able to present with him, if you will. So thank you again for joining me for this session. There was a question in the opening session with Dr. Anda about, so, you know, what can we do? How can we change anything when we only have so much time with these kiddos in an after-school program? And I think that's the natural question when you hear that information about ACEs. What can we do? So hopefully I'll be able to answer a little bit of that with this session. Though I want to be clear that when we talk about ACEs and the response and resilience and trauma-informed care and all those things, it really is more about changing culture versus specific strategies. So keep that in mind as we go forward, that really, you know, what Dr. Anda taught us is about sweeping change, and it's about changing the culture and how we meet one another and coming together with more compassion and kindness and curiosity versus shame and judgment and division. So, but I do want to give you some strategies for how we can, first of all, for recognizing traumatic experiences, for recognizing when somebody is in a trauma or a stress response, and then give you some strategies for how we can respond both programmatically and sort of in the moment with kiddos. But really, what it's going to come down to, and what we'll end with, is recognizing that self-care is a really, really important piece of this, because we are only going to be a good, competent, caring adult for those kiddos if we first take care of ourselves. So that's a little bit of a roadmap for where we're going today. We only have an hour and a lot of information, so we'll jump right in. I do want to invite you to find the chat box and use that chat box as we continue the presentation. I'll be watching. Jody, the facilitator, will be watching. So certainly if you have questions or things to add, and I'll ask some questions and ask you to respond in the chat box. So feel free to use that to communicate as we go through this. So when we talk about trauma and that stress response and what it looks like, when we are threatened, our bodies activate a variety of physiological responses. That may be an increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, stress hormones like cortisol start flowing through our body. And that's very, very purposeful. It also doesn't matter whether that threat is real or imagined. Our body will respond to our feeling of not being safe. And that happens in our very reptilian part of the brain that is automatic. It's not a thought process. We're not consciously choosing to react to a stressor. We're not consciously choosing to increase our heart rate or our blood pressure. But as long as we believe that we have the resources and the help to get through that stressor, we can stay in a healthy range of resilience, which you see on the top line of your screen here. When our amygdala and hippocampus within our limbic system is working correctly, working appropriately as it's intended, our amygdala is gonna ramp up in response to a stress stimuli. If you think about it like a gas and a brake pedal, our amygdala recognizes that there's a stressor in our environment and recognizes that our body needs to react to it. And so that kind of ramps us up like a gas pedal. Our hippocampus then is what is looking out to see, okay, the stressor has passed, we're no longer in danger, and it physiologically responds to bring us back down to our homeostasis. And so that's that normal, healthy flow of energy in the nervous system, a healthy range of resilience. We ramp up to stress. When that stress passes, we come back down to homeostasis. But when strong, frequent, or prolonged adverse experiences, things like extreme poverty or repeated abuse, when those things are experienced, particularly without support, that stress becomes toxic, and excessive cortisol can disrupt our developing brain circuits, like Dr. Anda talked about. So our bodies may trigger a sympathetic response or more of a mobilized response, think fight, flight, and we may actually become stuck there. We may become stuck in that fight or flight, constantly on the attack or constantly avoiding. And our body also recognizes if it doesn't seem like we can fight or run our way out of that trauma or that stressor or that adversity, our body may move further down into an immobile or a parasympathetic response. And we may become stuck in a dissociative state that appears numb or disconnected. But in either extreme, whether we're stuck on or stuck off, what's not able to happen in that is our ability to connect. That's what's interrupted. So here's what this might look like, particularly in kiddos. Do you see any of this in your programs, in your classrooms? I imagine we're seeing some increase in this after our spring semester and a full summer of social distancing and this ongoing stressor of COVID-19 and a pandemic that really has a lot of questions. But if you think about, if you expect it, we can pre-correct it. Now, we can't avoid or always stop this cycle, but we can stop a lot of it. And again, that starts with our own response. But we can be on the lookout for patterns and for hallmarks of our kids who are sliding off the road and be prepared to respond. And Dr. Anda talked about really the percentage of kids. So think about that with your classrooms. Probably the majority of our kids are pretty okay on an everyday basis, but we might have a smaller percentage of kids who need extra support, a little bit more support than the whole group, and probably only a small percentage of kids who really need a lot of extra help. So hopefully that helps it become a little bit more approachable, a little less overwhelming. We'll talk about a few interventions and supports that we can put into place for everybody and for those few kiddos who need more support. But the goal here is really about belonging. We want kids to feel like they belong. We want kids to feel a sense of accomplishment and confidence in their belonging with a group. We want them to feel like we're looking forward to our time with them. So that should be really overall what we're trying to do with our programming. And so I want to talk about this. This is often called the river of integration or the river of well-being. And this comes from Dan Siegel's work in his book Mindset. The left and the right side of our brain can kind of be imagined as two banks of a river, this river of integration, which we're floating in. And when life is going well, when we feel calm and not fazed by changing situations, or when we feel like we have an understanding of ourselves, our life, and what's going on around us, we can often sit and just enjoy the journey from the calmness that the middle of the road affords. But all too often as we travel throughout our day, we find ourselves being pulled closer to either bank of the river and maybe even becoming stuck. So when this happens, we move further away from emotional and mental health and less able to respond flexibly to challenging situations and difficult thoughts and feelings. So the two sides of the river are called chaos and rigidity. And keep in mind that this is everybody. So our kids are experiencing this, as are we. The right side of our brain is focused on emotion and images, personal memories, intuition and gut feelings. It sends and receives signals allowing us to communicate through facial expressions, eye contact, gestures, tone of voice. The right brain is really concerned about the meaning and feeling of experiences and relationships and focuses on the big picture. It concerns itself with the context of the situation rather than the content. And it's strongly connected to our body sensations and input from the lower part of our brain, which combine together to create emotions. The right brain is highly present in 0 to 3-year-olds, and it experiences emotional waves and floods. And when this happens, we find ourselves veering too close to the bank of chaos, feeling overwhelmed by difficult emotions and body sensations. We can feel out of control and sort of knocked around by the rapids close to that bank, or really inundated by those crashing emotional waves. It's at these times that we need the perspective of our left brain to help us handle the emotions that we're feeling. The left brain comes into the picture around about the time that our kids start asking why all the time. They begin to be interested in cause and effect. So it's the logical, literal, and linguistic side of the brain. It places things in sequential order and it uses language to express logic. It gives us order and structure, but it's very literal and it can lose perspective. Helpfully, this side of the brain enables us to express emotion in words. So it helps us to ride those emotional waves coming over from the right side. But when we float too close to this bank of rigidity, we can actually become inflexible and less able to adapt and negotiate or compromise. We can become literal, losing perspective, missing the meaning of putting things into context. We can also miss nonverbal cues and only hear the words spoken to us. And oftentimes we try to control everyone and everything when we're feeling emotionally overwhelmed. So the flip side to retreating, however, is that the right brain and its feelings can often be ignored or denied. And we can find ourselves in an emotional desert. When this happens, ourselves or our kiddos often appear distant with blank expressions, maybe voicing statements like, I don't care, it doesn't matter. Now, we often find ourselves sort of zigzagging from bank to bank throughout our day, not only dealing with our own situations, our own environments, but also, especially in your role, dealing with the zigzagging of the kiddos that we serve, who have their own boat and their own river of integration and well-being. So our challenge as helpers and as parents, if you're parents, often results from when our children are not in the flow of their own river. And so when they're either too chaotic or too rigid, for example, not being able to share, that's rigidity. Sort of losing it when another child takes a toy away from them, that's chaos. So it's important that we kind of think about how we as helpers and as caregivers can help our kiddos move back into the flow of that river, into a state that avoids both chaos and rigidity. But we have to be there first. So when we talk about understanding ACEs and the ACE study and neurobiology, we also talk about resilience. And people often get excited about the notion of resilience because it really reminds us that our supportive actions matter. And it leads us naturally to search for ways to help families and communities. And so what we know about resilience is that 3 protective systems interact and guide positive adaptation. And these powerful systems are individual capabilities, attachment and belonging with caring and competent people, and protective community, faith, and cultural processes. And what we know about people who do best despite adversity is that these three core protective systems are nested. So people do best in families and belonging within high capacity communities or communities that support them. So what we're going to focus on is those first two, individual capabilities and attachment and belonging. Carrie Sanderson from CPCM in her CAP note will talk more about that community piece and how we can build self-healing communities. So let's talk about some practical strategies for building up resilience in the kiddos that you work with. Now, I'm not going to be able to spend a lot of time because we only have an hour today, but I've shared this website and I would highly recommend that you take this down and visit it and think about how your program can benefit from going through these, the 7 C's of resilience. And this comes from the work of Dr. Kenneth Ginsburg. So the first C is competence. When we notice that young people are doing right and we give them opportunities to develop important skills, they feel competent. We undermine competence when we don't allow young people to recover themselves after a fall or a fail. Helping young people to see the lesson when failure occurs and that we can learn from failure and that failure is okay is really important. The second C is confidence. Young people need confidence to be able to navigate the world and think outside the box and recover from challenges. The third is connection, connections with other people, schools, communities. All those offer young people the security that allows them to stand on their own and develop creative solutions. Fourth is character. Young people need a clear sense of right and wrong and a commitment to integrity. Fifth is contribution. Young people who contribute to the well-being of others will receive gratitude rather than condemnation. Learn that contributing feels good and may more easily turn to others then and do so without shame. Sixth is coping. And Dr. Anda talked about this, right? Young people who possess a variety of health and coping strategies will be less likely to turn to those dangerous quick fixes like substances and smoking and alcohol when they're stressed. So giving young people healthy coping strategies of self-regulation. And then lastly is control. Young people who understand privileges and respect are earned through demonstrated responsibility will learn to make wise choices and feel a sense of control over what happens in their life. So all of these are individual capabilities that we can build up in young people in our programs. And so when you look at it programmatically, there are 2 essential questions to ask. And this goes back to mirror a bit of what Dr. Anda talked about. But within our walls, within our programming, do we believe in every young person unconditionally and hold them to high expectations? And the second question, do we sincerely believe that every child can succeed? Those are the 2 essential questions to ask programmatically. And then I would invite you to visit this website, fosteringresilience.com. There's a whole section that will have some sort of programmatic awareness questions in each of these 7 C's to determine if your programming is building up these individual capabilities in your program participants and your kiddos. So I highly recommend spending some time doing that, maybe as a team or individually, to think about how your program is building up competence, confidence, connection, character, contribution, coping, and control. So we often at CHS use this acronym of SERVE to talk about how we can help show up in the world and help build resilience all around us. So there are a lot of components to addressing things like dysregulation and building up resiliency. But one very simple thing that we can do is to share. So that is a big part of the Understanding ACEs education. It's sharing and educating, both of these first two. Sharing about our own experiences to the extent that we're comfortable, to help normalize those behaviors and those adaptations that Dr. Anda talked about that come from biological adaptations from stress. So the more that we can share our own experience, the more that the young people we work with and serve will understand their own adaptations and know that it's okay to talk about what's happening. Education, really, this is about creating a common language across the community and society, so that we all have a basic understanding of our human biological response to stress, all the things that Dr. Anda taught us this morning. When we do that, we further reduce the shame and blame when those behaviors don't meet societal expectation, but so that we can move beyond just an eject-reject system and wrap around and understand those adaptations and respond by building up skills versus just rejecting. Education and understanding will really increase the ability of all of us to respond compassionately. R is for regulate, regulating the body and the mind. And this, again, Dr. Anda talked about being able to do some self-regulation and recognizing that regulation starts with co-regulation. That's what we do as parents, right? When we have infants, they first learn to regulate by being soothed by an adult caregiver who responds to their needs. But we can continue to do this and teach these skills as young people and adults, because often we don't teach them as skills. We think that it should be something that we just figure out on our own. But self-regulation is moving past a sort of black and white thinking about I must do this thing or this is right and that's wrong. It's really about building up the self-awareness of our own bodily responses, and being really intentional about understanding what helps us to regulate, learning to step back and observe our responses, or sort of paying attention to the story that we tell ourselves, and not reacting to ourselves with judgment and shame, and instead going through those emotions that we feel. V is validating for ourselves and for kiddos that we work with, that all emotions are necessary and helpful, even those hard emotions like anger and grief. Those emotions are purposeful, and it's okay to be angry. It's okay to be sad. Certainly, it's we have to teach accountability, and that it's not okay to take those feelings of anger out on other people. But the feeling itself, the emotion itself, is purposeful and necessary. And then the last part of this is empowering the self that lies beneath, recognizing that when you're going through a hard time, all of us here, if we're here, we're batting 1,000 so far when it comes to survival. We've done it. We've survived. We've overcome hard things. We can do this for ourselves and for our kiddos when they're going through hard things, to remind yourself, to remind others, you've gone through hard things before and you were able to get through it. So let's think back to how you got through it before and build up that confidence in our ability to move through this and to succeed and to do it together. So when we move into sort of responding in the moment, when ourselves or our kiddos are really dealing with some tough emotions or some dysregulation, it really starts with safety. And the feeling of safety exists in the body, not just the mind. We can't think ourselves into being safe, into feeling safe, and neither can kiddos. We have to help kids feel safe. And remember, I talked about when we're stuck on or stuck off, what we're not doing is connecting. So that's where we have to get. If you think about the brain as 3 tiers, we have our brain stem, which is our automatic, our reptilian, our unconscious response. And that's really about survival. It's asking, am I safe? Then we move up into that limbic system, that lower brain, which is trying to figure out, am I loved? Am I connected? And then our upper brain, as we move into our upper brain, then we can start bringing in our prefrontal cortex and our thinking brain. And from there, we can think about, what can I learn? So when we think about connection, we have to sort of move through those 3 brain levels to get up to that thinking brain. So we have to start with supporting the child to feel physically and emotionally regulated. Then we can move to establishing a relational connection. And only then can we move into reasoning or accountability and logic. So think about how your program is currently doing this. How do you respond to dysregulation? I would invite you to share in the chat box if you're willing. Do you feel like you're doing a good job of this in terms of responding to dysregulated kiddos in the program? Are you starting with regulation and relation before you go into accountability or consequences? Or is there some room for improvement there? Do you have strategies for yourself to make sure you're in a place of relation and reasoning before you try to address problematic issues? But as you think about that, I want to share this video. It's about 5 minutes, but it talks about when a way to relate to kids, especially, and to teach them about brain science. So remember the S and E of that SERVE acronym was share and educate. So this is a way that we can do this with our kids. It's through the hand model of the brain. And I'm going to play the video and I can certainly share this resource as well. But think about, as you watch this, how can you use this information or use this video to help educate the kiddos that you work with, or maybe even your coworkers, to think about how we can connect before we redirect.
So I want to talk for a minute about how to teach the brain. One of the really important things that we know in trauma is that when we help people understand the injury trauma creates in the brain and help them understand how that impacts the way they respond to other events in the world, it really helps them and their families move forward in their healing. So lots of people have given ways to teach the brain. As a practitioner myself, I've taken a lot of the models from Dr. Dan Siegel, taken models from the Hahn Foundation for teaching in the optimistic classroom, and looking at some of the things Ledoux has done, and put them together and really challenged myself and folks that I educate about practicing really teaching the brain. So when I explain this to teenagers, I start with the hand model, okay? And I start by explaining that we're going to talk about the downstairs brain and the upstairs brain that everyone has. Formally, this is called the limbic system, and this is called the cerebral cortex. But what we're going to talk is downstairs brain and upstairs brain. So in your downstairs brain, this is where fight, flight, or freeze lives, okay? When threat comes at you, your body has 3 reactions it can make. It can fight, it can run away, or it can stay very still until the danger's gone. That's what this brain does, okay? This part of the brain. What's up here, the upstairs brain, its job, among many other things, is to solve problems, to help you calm down, solve problems, okay? And to tell the downstairs brain, I got this. We're going to be okay. There's another solution. So what happens a lot of times to kids who've experienced trauma is, if you think about these like muscles, because you've gone through a lot of threat, this downstairs part of the brain's been doing push-ups your whole life, okay? So this part of the brain's really strong. The part of your brain that solves problems hasn't had as much exercise because you've had to be really strong to be a survivor, a thriver. So what happens is that the brain gets what I call emotionally hijacked. This downstairs brain comes up on top of this brain, it takes over, okay? So the downstairs brain's in control. And so you fight, you run, you freeze. The only things that work when you're down here are things that calm you down. So we call them self-regulation skills. And that happens from connection. Somebody talking to you, helping you breathe, helping you feel your body calm down. Once that happens, then the upstairs brain can come back, and then you can solve problems. So that's how I try to explain to teenagers the downstairs brain and the upstairs brain and what happens to them when they experience a threat. With young children, what I've found is they like animals. When I say young, probably 3 to 8 years old. Sometimes teenagers like it too. And so what we call this is the downstairs brain, that threat center again, is what I call the barking dog. If you think about when any noise or threat makes, usually a dog will bark. So this is the barking dog, okay? A problem solver is often called the wise owl. So upstairs is the wise owl, downstairs is the barking dog, okay? When the dog barks, the owl flies away. And so when the dog's barking, the only things they can do are maybe practice blowing bubbles, maybe practice breathing deeply, things that help the dog start calming down. And that's where you build their self-care strategies. They practice lots of different things to help the dog stop barking. The first skill being recognizing when their dog barks. Once they learn how to calm the barking dog, then the owl flies back, and then they can come up with solutions. And again, they're trying to get this muscle stronger. The problem for most people who are intervening, if you're talking to a family, most parents are going to naturally start with redirection and consequences for negative behavior. That's the first place they go. They're shaking fingers and telling somebody, stop that, you need to do this. That's an upstairs brain intervention, while most children who've experienced trauma are downstairs. So the term Siegel uses is you connect, then you redirect. The only thing that will calm a barking dog or the downstairs brain is helping that child calm down. And only then, once you teach the child to calm down, can you engage the part of the brain that solves problems and actually come up with solutions for better behavior choices. And that's why it's important to respond to the need, respond to the safety needs that get kicked up by threat, and not just react to the behavior that happens.
Great. So I hope that as you're watching that, you have some takeaways from that resource. And again, I would invite you to go into the chat box and share with one another what resonates for you in that. How do you think that you can take that even today when you go to work and you have kids come into the program? How can you utilize this information? So she mentioned in the video, and I mentioned before, Dr. Dan Siegel. So these whole brain strategies come from his book, The Whole Brain Child, by Dr. Dan Siegel and Dr. Tina Bryson. If you have not checked out this resource, I would highly recommend it. These are the 12 strategies that he goes through. So I'm going to go through them very quickly, but certainly there are lots of resources here, and I would highly recommend the book to get the full value of this information. But she mentioned in the video, connect and redirect. So when your child or a child that you're working with is upset, you have to first connect emotionally, right brain to right brain. And then once your child is more in control and receptive, then you can bring in the left brain lesson and discipline. The second strategy is name it to tame it. So when those big right brain emotions are raging out of control, helping a kiddo tell the story about what's upsetting them. And in doing so, they'll begin to use their left brain to make sense of their experience and feel more in control. The third is engage, don't enrage. So in high stress situations, engage a kiddo's upstairs brain rather than triggering that downstairs brain. So don't immediately respond with, because I said so, or, I'm the adult, I'm in charge, that's why. Instead, appeal to the child's higher order thinking skills. Ask questions, ask for alternatives, even use negotiation to involve them in the response. Next is use it or lose it. So she talked about exercising that upstairs brain, right? Providing lots of opportunities to exercise that upstairs brain so it can be strong and integrated with that downstairs brain and with the body. Playing games like what would you do? Presenting them with dilemmas to try to solve. Through Children's Home Society, we actually developed a game called What If? And so for different age ranges, we have a box set of cards that lets you do this exact thing. What if you were at a sleepover and the adults were drinking? How would you respond? And there's some fun ones too, like what if your friend had a booger in their nose? How would you respond? So it's a great way to help them work through problems and dilemmas. And then we also have to avoid rescuing them from difficult decisions, letting them work through it so that they have confidence next time they come around to a problem. Next is move it or lose it. So again, when a child has lost touch with their upstairs brain, a powerful way to regain balance is to move your body. And I would highly encourage you to check out the next session with Move to Heal, because they're going to talk a lot about how we can engage our body in that regulation piece. Using the remote of the mind. So after a painful event, a child may be reluctant to narrate what happened, but the internal remote lets them pause, rewind, or fast forward a story as they tell it so that they can maintain control over how much they view or share. Remember to remember. So helping kiddos exercise their memory by giving them lots of practice at remembering. So finding different ways to help kiddos talk about their experiences so that they can integrate their implicit and explicit memories. Next is let the clouds of emotion roll by. So this is about reminding kids that feelings come and go. Fear, frustration, loneliness, they're all temporary states. They're not enduring traits. SIFT, S-I-F-T. This is about helping kids pay attention to sensations, images, feelings, and thoughts within themselves. Excuse me. They can't understand and change their inner experiences until they're first aware of what's going on inside. The next strategy is exercise mindsight, getting back to the hub. So mindsight practices teach children to calm themselves and focus their attention where they want. 11 is really enjoy each other, increase the fun factor, build fun into the program so that kids are enjoying positive and satisfying experiences with the people that they're around. And then finally, connect through conflict. So trying not to view conflict as an obstacle to avoid, but instead using it as an opportunity to teach kids essential relationship skills like seeing other people's perspective and reading nonverbal cues, making amends. These are all strategies that you can use to help kids increase those 7 C's of resilience. Excuse me. But again, and I know I probably feel like I'm beating a horse here, but first things first is you have to take care of yourself first. It's a cliche, but there's a reason it's a cliche about you have to put on your own oxygen mask first before you can help someone else. So this comes through a lot of ways. First, it's knowing our own triggers, knowing our own either personal trauma or secondary trauma experiences, knowing our own, understanding what our own banks of chaos and rigidity look like for us, and being able to recognize when we're veering off into one or another of those banks, and being able to also know what works for us to come back into that river of integration, that river of well-being. Part of that too is understanding your own support system. Who around you can help support you, and who, particularly in your work, can you reach out to for help and assistance when you find yourself veering off into one of those banks? Who around you can help you get back into that river of well-being? So we're gonna, and certainly everything that I've talked about so far can be applied to yourself as well. But I'm gonna shift in sort of talking more about ourselves and our self-care. Know that as we go through this, obviously this understanding too can be conveyed to your kiddos and the kiddos that you serve. But I want to talk a little bit about the different domains of resilience. So there are 4 primary domains of resilience: physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. And we have resilience in each domain, but some people are naturally more resilient in one domain than another. But each domain affects the other. So an example of this interrelation of these domains would be When we feel overwhelmed and frustrated, that's in our emotional domain. So we may feel overwhelmed and frustrated because we have too much to do. And then we have difficulty thinking clearly, which moves into our mental domain. And then this could cause tense muscles, maybe a tension headache. So that moves into our physical domain. And then all of that may work together and create less tolerance of another's belief system. That's the spiritual domain. So you can see how these are all interrelated. And so when we talk about building up our resilience, we have to think holistically. And our goal then is that middle yellow circle, that coherence, that balance. This isn't about perfection, and it's not about having a perfection in all of these domains, but it's really about thinking holistically so that we are focusing a little bit in each domain. So you can see on the slide that resilience is reflected in each domain. So for example, in the physical domain, resilience is reflected in our endurance, in our strength, in our physical flexibility. So building capacity in any of these domains means we have to stretch beyond our norm, and then we stabilize at that new level. And so doing this increases our baseline capacity for resilience in that domain. So I want to draw attention to the emotional domain because it's here that we tend to waste a lot of unnecessary anger. Think about, and again, feel free to share in the chat box, how do you feel an hour after becoming really angry? How does that feel for you? And if somebody else triggered your anger, whose energy is being drained by your anger, with your anger? So plugging energy leaks in that emotional domain can save a lot of energy and build up our resilience capacity. And again, that's going to affect all domains. And building that capacity is key to enhancing our ability to self-regulate. So let's think about this as an example in the physical domain to think about building capacity. I think we all know how we can build capacity in our physical domain of resilience, right? We can do more push-ups, we can run, lift weights. So if we want to increase our capacity for any of those things, we take on a challenge, right? Such as maybe increasing the amount of weight we want to lift. But we start slow, right? So gradually we increase the weight or the distance if we want to run so far, but we do it gradually. And as we gradually increase the weight we're lifting or the distance we're running, that becomes our new norm. So we've increased our capacity to do that. Building capacity works the same way in each domain. So think about the example of a traffic jam. I think all of us have probably experienced, maybe not a traffic jam per se, but I always think about being on a 2-lane highway that's really hilly and you just can't pass. That is a stressful situation for me. I can get frustrated, angry, impatient. Those are a lot of the feelings that I'll feel if I'm stuck in traffic and trying to get somewhere. But there again, does that feeling of impatience and frustration move traffic any faster? Does that get me where I want to go any faster? So again, whose energy is being drained? My own. I'm draining my own energy there. So here again, we can take on a challenge to increase our emotional resilience and choose not to let that traffic jam bother me in that moment. And so that builds my capacity to be in charge of my emotions and how I respond. When I build up that emotional muscle, I'm going to have more capacity to self-regulate, not only in that situation of a traffic jam or slow traffic, but in other situations as well. I'm working that emotional resilience muscle, and I'm creating a new capacity and a new norm. And we can do that in all of these domains. So I don't have a ton of time, so I'm going to move through these pretty quickly, but I'm happy to share these slides, and I'll share my email address at the end. So if you want a copy of the slides or additional resources, feel free to email me, and I'll find out if there's a way to do that within the conference platform. But let's talk about some immediate immediate strategies for grounding in all of these domains and in all of these areas. So some physical strategies are really helpful to focus on our body and our senses. And this can be really useful for things like dissociation, anxiousness, feeling really disconnected from our bodies. When we're feeling this sort of dysregulation, physical strategies can help for immediate grounding. And these are just a couple. Keep in mind that not everything is going to work for everyone, and you just need to find what works for you. But what's really important here is a connection between the body and the mind. And so in order to find that balance, it's important to cover both areas. So that may be taking very purposeful breaths. Breathing is really the biggest thing that we can do for regulation, is learning how to breathe in a way that is helpful, taking those deep, deep breaths in through our nose, holding, out through our mouth, holding. And we can teach kiddos this too. I often use the example of hot cocoa for kiddos. So to teach them to take deep breaths in a helpful way, I ask them to breathe in through their nose as if they're smelling their hot cocoa. And then hold for a couple seconds. And then when they breathe out, I ask them to pretend like they're cooling down their hot cocoa. And hold. And so that's a way for them to help remember when they're upset, hot cocoa. That's how I breathe. And it helps them remember in through their nose, out through their mouth in a helpful way. Another great strategy, especially right now. So we've never had more focus on washing our hands, right? Washing our hands can be a physical strategy. We can choose to use that as a mindful moment. So rather than just quickly washing our hands and not thinking about it, we can take our time and we can be really present in that moment and focus on the feeling of the water, the temperature of the water, the feeling of the bubbles in the soap between our fingers. By just taking that 2 minutes to be completely present in that moment, we're calming our body down, we're calming our sympathetic response system and bringing our whole body back down to regulation. Mental strategies help to focus and activate your mind to cope with those feelings of anxiety and distress or discomfort, again, while remaining present. So I think about mental strategies as really interrupting that mental spiral. That's what it feels like for me. It feels like a mental spiral. It's rumination for me. So I'm cycling and I can't get out of that mental spiral of what I'm thinking about. And so some strategies that can help for immediate grounding, if that's where you're at, are these things. Really describing your environment is in detail. So I've gone through an exercise where they've asked me, and this gets a little wonky, but imagine you're a cat in your environment. So if you think about the curiosity that a cat explores their environment with, to do that within your environment helps you to really refocus your mind and explore your environment in a new way. And then other things you can do is focus on naming the objects around you. You can do a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 exercise with your senses. So 5 things you can see or touch. 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things that you can hear, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing that you can taste. That is the way to interrupt that mental spiral. And then if all else fails, something that can really help, especially with kiddos, is to repeat the alphabet or read a sentence, a written sentence, but read it slowly or backwards. Again, that helps just interrupt that mental spiral. Emotional strategies help focus and activate your mind to increase relaxation and feelings of safety and comfort. So these are really things that evoke positive feelings. Things like thinking of your favorite season or song or movie. I think it's part of, what the holiday season does for a lot of us with those songs that have memories attached to them, right? And those can be good or bad. Hopefully they're good and they're feelings of well-being and safety. But what's important is to do the work ahead of time so that you know these things, so that you know the songs that evoke those positive feelings or good memories. Maybe it's a smell, like the smell of sugar cookies may bring you back to a time when you're a child baking cookies with your grandma. If that's a good memory, that smell can evoke that positive feeling and memory. You can also be really proactive about keeping a collection of poems or lyrics or quotes that help you evoke those positive feelings. Writing kind notes to yourself, or I like to, if I get thank you notes or accolades via email about a job well done, I like to keep those in a certain place. So if I get to a point where I'm feeling not great about primarily in my professional life, if I'm in a funk and feeling like I'm not very good at my job, I can go to that email folder and I can read notes from a bunch of people who say, no, Cassie, you're actually really good at this. And thank you for doing the work that you're doing. That's huge for me. And that can immediately evoke those positive feelings. And then again, the sort of touchy-feely one that doesn't work for everybody, but giving yourself a hug and rocking back and forth can actually scientifically proven that motion of rocking back and forth will actually stimulate those positive feel-good chemistry regions of the brain to release norepinephrine. And so do that, just wrap your arms around yourself and maybe rock back and forth for a little while. It might seem a little touchy-feely or hippie for you, but it really does work. So try it. So the fourth piece, that spiritual and cultural care, I want to be very clear that this is not about religion. This is really up to you to define what gives you that spiritual feeling, that sense of being connected to the world around you, being a small but important piece in a larger collective. That's really what this spirituality piece is. And so this can look a number of different ways. It could be through prayer, meditation, worship music, service to one another, dance, particularly cultural dance. And again, I would point you to the next session with Move to Heal, because they really talk about dance and that healing power of movement. Connecting with nature is often helpful for folks. Just being surrounded by nature, reminding yourself that you are certainly important, but you are a small piece in a much bigger world. And then when we talk about long-term resilience building, these are the things, right? No groundbreaking announcements here. We all really know what we need to do. And true self-care, it doesn't cost anything. It's drinking water, it's getting enough sleep, it's going outside occasionally to get that vitamin D, moving, breathing. These are the things that it all comes down to. I want to acknowledge that self-care has turned into a bit of a buzzword. It's a word that we hear often, but we don't often think about what it truly means. It as buzzwords do, it starts to morph and change and mean something else, or be used in a system of capitalism that has money attached to it. And then often it starts to come with its own level of shame, of not doing good enough, of not practicing enough self-care, of if we're not, if we're getting into one of those banks, that it's on us that we're not doing good enough. That comes with shame and guilt. And I want you to shed that. If you're feeling any of that, I want you to shed that. And I hope that you will, because really it comes down to just being aware of what works for us and why. So we can easily get overwhelmed by all the things that we should do, that we often are not checking in with our own bodies, our own selves. And that might be the only really radical idea I can offer, is to actually ask your own body what it needs instead of just taking in what the world around you is telling you, me included. Check in with yourself and your own body. And here's how you maintain it. It's about practice, not perfection. Do what works for you. This is not a one size fits all. Check in with yourself, do what works for you. If you find you have areas or room for improvement, set small, manageable goals. Don't do too much too soon. Be aware of each of those domains of resilience and try to improve in each area if you need to. And most importantly, ask for help. Your self-care must certainly be a priority for you, but it also needs to be a priority for those around you. So if I have any program leaders in the group, think about how your program prioritizes the self-care of your staff, because that's important. And at home too, it's important that your network is, your self-care is a priority for them as well. So take, for example, getting 8 hours of sleep. If you identify that getting 8 hours of sleep is a priority and a strategy that you need to focus on, you also need that to be a priority for the rest of the people in your home, right? So if everybody together agrees getting 8 hours of sleep is important for me, then we're all going to work together to make sure that I get those 8 hours of sleep, and the people around me aren't going to interrupt that or challenge that priority. And same at work. It's important that we work together and that we recognize our support system. So finally, I encourage you and invite you to create a self-care safety plan for yourself. And here's how you do this. 5 parts: who, what, where, when, and how. So who can you reach out to at work, and who can you reach out to outside of work? Who are those people that you can identify that are going to make your self-care a priority, just like you're going to make it a priority? And these are people who should give you a sense of safety, an invitation, and a place of transparency where you can be honest about where you're at and get encouragement. What is about those strategies? What is it that helps you come back to a place of calm and peace? You can start with one, but work to identify one in each of those areas: emotional, mental, physical, spiritual. Where is a place that helps you, again, find that sense of peace or positive memories. It may be out in nature. It may be a corner of your home. It may be your favorite coffee shop. It's just a place where you know that you can go and feel that sense of safety and peace and calm. When, this is about being intentional about the time of the days. That 2 things: a time of day that may spike your stress levels, and the time that works well for you to have quiet and check in with yourself. So look for those 2 times of day, and then be intentional about recognizing those patterns and working to interrupt. How? This is really, how will you know that you're doing better? Identify at least 2 things that will improve if you're coping better, if your self-regulation is better. How will you know? What 2 things can you identify that will improve if you're making this a priority for yourself? And then it's really important that you have this written out so that you can refer back to it. And then you may want to update it as your practice progresses. You may want to update it. You may want to change. As we're building up those resilience muscles, we're going to reach new normals, and then we may want to strive for a new challenge. So have it written down so that you can refer back to it, and also so that you can share it with those people in your network who you identify as helping your priority. So I know that was a lot of information for an hour presentation. I appreciate you being here, and I really do want to invite you to reach out via email if you would like a copy of the slides, if you would like additional resources. I think we have a few minutes left if anybody has questions. You're welcome to share that in the chat box. Or again, please feel free to reach out individually to ask any questions or get additional resources. Were there any questions in the chat box that I missed?
Not that I saw, no.
Okay, great. Thanks for those comments. Yes, Laura, kinder and less direct sometimes is a good goal, particularly in marriage. And for sure, we're talking about work here because it's an after-school conference, but all of this, including what Dr. Anda said, all of this is about relationships first, and those relationships take place everywhere, whether at home or at work. But yeah, planning it, being purposeful is so important, and it's really easy to set that aside. It's really easy, especially I think this group, you're in the work that you're in because you're a giver, because you're a caretaker, you're a helper. And for us helpers and caregivers, the last person that we take care of is often ourselves. So I'm here to remind you to put your own oxygen mask on first. Start with yourself, start small, and we will just be that much better for the kiddos that we serve and for our spouses, our partners, our coworkers. When we foster the light inside of us, we have much more to give to those around us. So I just want to encourage you in your practice and encourage you to set some time aside to make that self-care plan. Thanks so much for your time, everybody.